I want you to imagine something. It's a Tuesday morning. You open your news app and the first three headlines are strikes at Dubai International Airport, missile interceptions over Saudi Arabia, and rocket attacks near Baghdad's airport. Now ask yourself, when's the last time the Gulf was this volatile? Because what's happening right now in March of 2026 is not a contained skirmish between two countries. It's a regional pressure campaign targeting the infrastructure that keeps the global economy functioning, ports, airports, energy routes, and the single most important oil choke point on the planet. In this video, I'm going to walk you through what's actually happening in the Gulf, why the United States just moved 2,500 Marines into the conflict zone, what the International Energy Agency's emergency declaration actually means for the price of everything in your life, and why France and Italy are now negotiating directly with Iran to keep shipping lanes open. This is not a regional story. This is a global economic story wearing a military uniform. Let's start with the strikes. Here's what happened. Iran warned major UAE ports to evacuate, and then, within hours, the attacks came. Drone and missile strikes were reported across the Gulf region, with confirmed damage at Dubai International Airport and active interceptions over Saudi Arabia. Iraq also saw rocket attacks near Baghdad airport. Now, before we get into the strategic implications, I want to pause on that list for a moment because Dubai International is one of the busiest airports in the world. It's not a military base, it's not a weapons depot, it's a hub through which hundreds of thousands of passengers and billions of dollars of cargo move every single week. When you put Dubai International in the crosshairs, you're not just striking a military target, you're sending a message to every airline, every logistics company, every cargo insurer, and every government that routes traffic through the Gulf. Nowhere is safe. And that's the strategy. Not destruction, disruption, anxiety, economic pressure applied through threat rather than conquest. Iraq adds another layer to this. The rocket attacks near Baghdad airport bring a third country into the blast radius of this conflict, a country that already sits at the intersection of American, Iranian, and regional influence. Every time a new geography gets pulled in, the conflict becomes harder to contain, and containment is exactly what everyone is desperately trying to achieve right now. So what does this do to the Strait of Hormuz? The strait is the narrow passage through which roughly 20% of the world's traded oil flows. It's about 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. And right now, it is under more strategic threat than it has been in a generation. We'll come back to the Hormuz story in depth when we get to the European diplomacy section. But hold that number in your head, 20%, because everything that follows connects back to it. Now, where does the United States fit into all of this? U.S. military deployment. On March 13th, AP reported that the U.S. is deploying roughly 2,500 Marines and an amphibious assault ship into the conflict zone. Washington framed this as a response to the widening Iran crisis. I want to show you how to read this. Because governments lie in press conferences, governments cannot lie in troop deployments. When Marines board ships and sail toward a crisis, that is not a rhetorical gesture. That is a physical commitment of resources, planning, and lives. And it tells you something very specific about what military planners think is coming. A deployment of 2,500 Marines with an assault ship is what the U.S. military calls a Marine Expeditionary Unit, or MEU. It's a self-contained, rapid response force capable of amphibious operations, air assault, and sustained combat. You don't deploy an MEU to a region as a press statement. You deploy it because your planning scenarios include a scenario where things get significantly worse. That doesn't mean war is inevitable. It means war is being taken seriously. And in geopolitics, there's a meaningful difference between a government that takes something seriously and one that doesn't. There's also a second reason deployments like this happen: deterrence. The logic is, if Iran sees a Marine Expeditionary Unit, a carrier strike group, and attack aircraft in the same battle space, the calculation for escalation changes. The cost of the next move goes up. The problem with deterrence, though, is that it only works if the other side reads the signal correctly. And in an environment where multiple actors, Iran, regional militias, Houthi forces, potentially others, are operating simultaneously across multiple countries, the risk of miscalculation rises with every new asset added to the board: one ship at the wrong place, one drone that looks like an attack when it isn't, one intercepted communication that gets misread. In a battle space this crowded, a mistake can escalate faster than any diplomatic back channel can respond. That's the real danger the Marine deployment signals. Not American aggression, but the density of the situation itself. And underneath all of this, and underneath the strikes, the deployments, the diplomatic warnings, is the energy question. And that's where the story gets personal for everyone watching. The IEA emergency, the largest oil supply disruption in history. On March 12th, the International Energy Agency made an extraordinary announcement. The Middle East conflict has triggered the largest oil supply disruption ever recorded. Not in recent memory, not since the 1973 oil embargo, ever recorded. The number is approximately 8 million barrels per day, knocked out in March alone. To put that in context, global oil consumption is roughly 100 million barrels a day. Losing 8 million is like pulling the engine out of the 8th largest economy in the oil market. And it happened within weeks. The IEA approved a massive strategic reserve release in response, drawing down the emergency stockpiles that countries maintain precisely for moments like this. And even with that release, oil has surged. Markets are on edge, and central banks are now facing a problem they thought they'd left behind. Here's the thing most people don't understand about oil prices. They're not just a number at the gas station. They're embedded in the cost of almost everything. When oil goes up, shipping costs go up. When shipping costs go up, the price of every physical product that travels on a truck, a plane, or a cargo ship goes up. Groceries, electronics, medicine, building materials, energy-intensive manufacturing, and steel, cement, chemicals, all of it gets more expensive. And here's the second-order effect that makes this genuinely dangerous. Inflation that comes from an external supply shock is the hardest kind for central banks to fight. When you raise interest rates to fight inflation, you're trying to reduce demand, but you can't reduce demand for oil. That's simply not there. You can't build new refineries overnight. You can't reroute supply chains in a quarter. So central banks are stuck. If they cut rates to support slowing economies, they risk letting inflation reaccelerate because energy costs are still high. If they hold rates high to fight inflation, they risk tipping slowing economies into recession. This is the definition of a policy trap, and it's what economists mean when they talk about stagflation. We'll revisit that in the next video, but understand that this IEA number is the root of that fear. So what is Europe actually doing about this? Because their exposure to a Hormuz crisis is arguably more acute than America's. France, Italy, and the diplomacy gambit. On March 13th, the Financial Times reported that France and Italy have opened direct talks with Iran to secure safe passage through the Strait of Hormuz. Not through the U.S., not through NATO directly, Paris and Rome talking to Tehran. This is a significant departure from the playbook of the last 2 decades, where Gulf security was essentially managed by American military presence and regional alliances. What France and Italy are doing is saying explicitly, we cannot wait for the military solution. We need a diplomatic off-ramp now because the economic clock is running. Europe imports enormous quantities of Gulf energy. A prolonged Hormuz crisis doesn't just raise prices, it creates physical scarcity risks for countries that are still rebuilding energy security after the Russia-Ukraine shock. The last thing European governments need is another energy emergency layered on top of everything else. So the European calculation is pragmatic, even if it's uncomfortable. An imperfect deal with Iran that keeps ships moving is better than a perfect military operation that takes months and costs more. The risk is obvious. Iran is a sophisticated negotiating partner that has used diplomatic openings strategically in the past, buying time, extracting concessions, and not necessarily honoring the results. France and Italy know this. They're betting that the shared economic interest in open shipping lanes creates at least a temporary alignment of incentives. What this episode also reveals is something bigger about the Western alliance. When European powers start negotiating directly with Iran over energy choke points, independently of Washington, you're seeing the post-American security architecture start to emerge in real time. It's not dramatic. It doesn't announce itself, but it's there. Let me bring this together. The Gulf crisis, as of March 15, 2026, is not a single event. It's a system of pressures operating simultaneously, military, economic, diplomatic, and psychological, across multiple countries and multiple time horizons. The strikes are real and they're spreading. The U.S. is in the arena with serious combat-capable assets. The global oil supply has taken a historic hit that will take months to fully assess. And Europe is improvising a diplomatic track because it cannot afford to wait. If you want to understand what comes next, watch 3 things. Watch the Strait of Hormuz, whether ships resume normal transit or whether insurance markets keep pulling out. Watch the IEA reserve levels. How fast they deplete tells you how long the market thinks this disruption lasts. And watch the European talks with Iran and whether they produce a formal commitment or just delay. The Gulf has been the center of global energy geopolitics for 50 years. What's happening right now may be the most consequential test of that system since 1973. Don't let the noise of daily headlines make you miss the structural story. In the next video, we're going to look at the economic shock this is sending through global markets, stagflation fears, the U.S.-China dynamic, and how NATO is fracturing over who picks up the bill. See you there.